Bé, bon dia, benvinguts i moltes gràcies per ser aquí. Jo soc en Josep Ibañez, soc professor de Relacions Internacionals i comissionat per EUTOPIA i programes internacionals a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra, i en representació del rectorat vull agrair la Tamara Djermanovic per organitzar aquest acte i molt especialment vull agrair al nostre convidat, el professor Plokhy, per haver tingut la deferència de venir-nos a parlar d'un tema que continua sent d'actualitat i que, per sort per tots nosaltres, veig que suscita molt d'interès. Comentàvem ara que de vegades és una mica difícil saber si tindrem suficient públic quan organitzem algunes activitats que impliquen portar convidats de prestigi. Afortunadament, en aquest cas, l'escenari i l'espai s'ha quedat petit i per això us agraeixo la presència. I, as I've just said, we really thank you for coming to Universitat Pompeu Fabra. I hope you're enjoying your stay in Barcelona at UPF, and it's an honor for us to have you here. And we are looking forward to having your views on this topic, which is not new. And I leave the floor to Tamara. Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you. Bon dia, buenos días, col·legues, estudiants, amics i amigues. Serhii Plokhy, thank you to be here with us. Tenim l'enorme plaer de tenir avui a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra a Serhii Plokhy, una de les persones més autoritzades per parlar del tema d'Ucraïna, de les relacions entre Rússia i Ucraïna, del seu passat, present i possiblement també del seu futur. Agraïm a la universitat, especialment a la Facultat i Departament d'Humanitats, l'Institut de Cultura, on s'emmarca el Seminari d'Estudis Eslaus que jo personalment coordino. Serhii Plokhy, nascut a Ucraïna, Zaporizhia, és actualment professor d'Història a la Universitat de Harvard, on va dirigir fins fa pocs mesos Russo-Ukrainian Research Institute. Ell escriu: en un nou entorn internacional definit per la proliferació d'armes nuclears, la desintegració de l'ordre internacional posterior a la Guerra Freda i el ressorgiment del nacionalisme populista, Ucraïna és més que mai la línia divisòria més volàtil entre l'autoritarisme i l'Europa democràtica. Plokhy, que a Harvard ocupa la càtedra d'Història Mikhailo Khrushchevsky, és autor d'una vintena de llibres que reflecteixen els seus interessos, que inclouen la història intel·lectual, cultural internacional d'Europa de l'Est, amb especial èmfasi en Ucraïna i Rússia, com també tracta els temes de l'energia nuclear, com podem veure també dels títols dels seus llibres. 4 dels seus llibres estan publicats a Espanya: Las puertas de Europa, pasado y presente de Ucrania, La guerra russo-ucraniana, el retorno de la historia, Locura nuclear, una historia de las crisis de los misiles en Cuba, y El último imperio, los días finales de la Unión Soviètica. Li donem ara la paraula per intentar apropar aquesta situació bèl·lica, parlar de la invasió russa d'Ucraïna. Ens parlarà d'aquest conflicte a través, com ell diu, d'ull d'un historiador, dels orígens d'aquest conflicte, el seu desenvolupament i les seves conseqüències per al futur, tenint present sempre, tal com ell diu en el prefaci del seu llibre La guerra russo-ucraniana, llegeixo, cito: yo no estaba preparado ni emocional ni profesionalmente para reflexionar ni para explicarme a mí mismo y a otros lo que sucedía como consecuencia de una agresión rusa no provocada. Pero a medida que más medios de comunicación iban contactando conmigo para pedirme opinión, me parecía que no podía negarme a responder, porque quizá con mis palabras consiguiera lograr cierto impacto en el desarrollo de los acontecimientos. Me di cuenta de que como historiador podía aportar algo de lo que otros carecían a la hora de comprender el mayor conflicto militar en Europa desde el fin de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Como historiador, he hecho todo lo que he podido para poner en perspectiva histórica y comparada los acontecimientos que se iban desarrollando delante de mí y del mundo en su conjunto. Thank you very much to be here, and now you have the... Gracias.
Gracias, Professor Djermanovic. Bom dia, benvinguts e benvingudes. It's a real pleasure to be here in Barcelona, in Catalonia. I, in particular, want to thank Professor Djermanovic for this invitation, and thank you very much to the university, to the school, for helping to organize this event. I understand that in this room some people are more equal than others, and I don't mean people sitting on the floor versus sitting people in chairs, but I have in mind that I understand some students read already parts of my book and some of my interviews. So maybe you'll find something what I'm going to talk about familiar, but I hope that most of what I'm going to say will be new, or at least relatively new. As you already know from the introduction, I'm a historian, and the topic that I'm going to talk about today, it's very contemporary. It's contemporary to a degree that we really don't know how long this war will continue. We don't know how it will end. And the question is whether this is generally a legitimate task for a historian to talk, to write on the things that are not yet completed. So as historians, and it's better maybe to leave to people in political sciences and international relations, military experts, who are better trained, better equipped, just through their profession, to talk about that. We historians, generally, we study things that and processes that already came to an end. By the way, our wisdom comes from the fact that we already know the end. We know the end, we know the answer, and then we go back and we will actually, we try to analyze, to understand, to explain, but all of that with knowing the outcome, which is, again, very important for our profession, but also puts particular limitations on that profession, because you almost automatically assume that the things had to turn out the way how they turned out. And in that sense, going outside of that field of history classically defined as something that already came to an end, may be productive, and that was one of the at least explanations or excuses that I found for myself when I went into writing on the current war, on the Russo-Ukrainian war. We are also trained to work as historians with archives. And it's extremely important, especially when it's an international development, to look on the archives and materials and perspectives coming from different sides. Certainly, writing on the war that is happening today, it's a big challenge. The archives, if they're there, they're certainly very closed, and there is generally lack of information. And on the top of that, information that is produced is very often information specifically produced to mislead, right? That's what the war is about. You try to mislead your enemy, you try to mislead whoever the observers are, which creates, of course, additional challenge for historians, but almost really for anyone who tries to write and study the wars at the time when they're happening. But as with the previous limitation that I talked about, and that's the not knowing the outcome of the war and avoiding teleological approach, the fact that the traditional sources for historian are absent for this war, that also forces you to be more innovative. And what I found in my research, and I published two books that I never thought I would write, and of course publish, one on the general on the Russo-Ukrainian war, another on the Russian occupation of Chernobyl nuclear power plant, I discovered such wonderful source as social media. So that's sort of the resource and information that, of course, historians of the past never had and never could dream about. Something that really records your reaction or your thought right now at the moment. The historians, generally, we are very lucky when on the top of the officials' documentation and correspondence, we would find a memoir. Okay, there is some human perspective, but the memoir would be written years and sometimes decades after the event. Even the diaries are written at the best at the end of the day when you know how the day ended. And social media really provides the kind of sources that were not there before. So all of that, what I'm talking about, it's sort of an explanation of why a historian writes on the war and whether a historian can actually say anything of importance given the limitations produced by the sources, but also produced by the particular conventions of profession. I convinced myself that I can do something, and in my book I rephrased famous Churchill's saying that democracy is the worst form of government except every other form of government. So I came up with this line that historians are the best commentators on contemporary developments except everybody else. So setting the bar low really helps and gives you some incentive and some courage to do things that otherwise you would not do. Now, what really history can afford in looking at this contemporary war? One thing is that historians always did, almost from the birth of the either it's art or science of writing history, is look at the origins. So origins of this war on many levels is certainly something that is extremely important in helping us understand what the war is about, what is at stake, explain to a certain degree the behavior of different sides. Another very important part of the story is intellectual history of the war and of the conflicts, which goes into ideology, which goes also into the explanation, at least the way how that ideology is being formed and how each different sides explain their actions. And last but not least, one of the definitions of history is that historians, they study the continuity and change in the societies. And if you study continuity and change, so you know the past, or at least you try to learn the past. And hopefully historians have a better eye for understanding what is new. What is a continuation and what is new? And that's also what I will try to do today. So talk about the intellectual underpinnings of the war, the propaganda that surrounds the war, the causes of the war, but also I will try to talk about what is new and what is the impact on the world, how the world is changing or is already different than it was at the start and the beginning of the war. So that's my approach, and that's roughly the plan for today's presentation. So I will start with the intellectual part of the story and the way how the Russia in particular, the country that started the war, how it explains its behavior. First of all, just some very basics about the war, which are out there, but sometimes we forget about them. The war didn't start in February of 2022, What started was the significant escalation, the all-out Russian aggression against Ukraine. The war started in 2014 with the annexation of the Crimea and de facto taking control over parts of Ukrainian territory in the east of the country. This chronology is very important also for understanding the causes of the war. But before the all-out aggression started, before it produced the largest war in Europe since 1945, half of a year before that, President Vladimir Putin put on the website of the presidential administration a historical essay or pseudo-historical essay, which was called On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And then again and again in his pronouncements, he keeps coming to history, to historical explanation of Russia's war, and to a degree that he does that at the extent of another line that was taken by Russia, that it's the war, it's a response to NATO expansion. So for those of you who maybe heard about that or maybe had a chance to watch probably the longest interview of Putin in the last few years to the American interviewer Tucker Carlson, 30 minutes of conversation went about the history, medieval history of Rus and Kievan Rus, which just points in the direction that this is something that for Putin particularly and personally is very important. The essay is long and convoluted, but it's the key point is in the first paragraph, in the first couple sentences. And what Putin says there is that I have been saying again and again that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, or one nation. And here I will explain from the historical point of view why I am right and why I'm saying that. And then a lot of bad history follows, with the logic not being necessarily there, including claims that it's Lenin who created Ukraine, so certain things that are completely absurd. But for me, it was when I saw that essay. For me, as a historian who studied Russian, East European, Ukrainian intellectual history for a long period of time, there was a lot that immediately kind of struck me that was familiar. And what it was the idea about Russians and Ukrainians being one and the same people. Because let's translate that into the plain language. What does it mean Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people? It doesn't mean that Russians are really Ukrainians. It means that Ukrainians are really Russians, that they never existed, they don't exist, and they shouldn't exist. They are part of a big Russian nation. And the argument is bizarre, but the argument that has a long history in the Russian imperial tradition, and it is represented here with this poster coming from the early 20th century, where you see under the Russian flag, under the Russian banner, under the Russian imperial eagle, three ladies that represent Russian nation of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, or the way how it was imagined by the key historians, key intellectual figures, key political figures of the Russian Empire. And the idea was there that there exists Russian nation, and then there are different tribes there. They were called tribes in the 19th century. One of them were Great Russian, today's Russia. Then there was Little Russian, so today's Ukrainians. And then there were White Russians, or Belarusians. And they constituted, yes, there were differences, linguistic and cultural and historical and others, but generally they constituted one big Russian imperial nation. You can look at this poster. So the Great Russian lady is at the center, and then to her right is Little Russian or Ukrainian lady, and then on the other side is the Belarusian or White Russian. I want you to just pay attention that it's only one lady that has both the cross and the sword. So which also gives you some idea about the relationship between the alleged tribes or alleged groups within this Russian imperial nation, which is basically which is Russian and run by Russia. That was the idea, the imperial idea that was there, that was developed, that was certainly shared by the commanders of the Russian army during the revolution, people like Anton Denikin, the general, and it was defeated by the Bolsheviks and went into exile, and then later came back to Russia after 1991. And what Putin is trying to do today, when you read what he writes, when you listen what he says, he is trying to take an outdated 19th century imperial model of what Russia is and bring it into the 20th century with the force of army, with the force of weapons, with the force of the nuclear blackmail. So I define this war as 19th century war in terms of ideology, a 20th century war in terms of the tactics that are being used on the front line, and 21st century war in terms of technology that is being used, with the drones completely changing the nature of the warfare in the modern world. So following then to the logic of the essay, but also following the history of the region, the Soviet period for Putin, it's a very negative thing. So he attacks in the essay not only Lenin, but also criticizes Stalin. And he is doing that for the really recognizing Ukrainians as a separate nation, which is very much in line with the General Denikin and this so-called white generals, the other side in the Russian Civil War, who are blaming the Bolsheviks allegedly for, and Lenin in particular, for ending the unity of Russia, of Russian Empire, of the Russian people, and creating artificial nations. Well, historically speaking, of course, it's completely wrong interpretation. Lenin is not creating Ukraine or any other country. He is waging the war on Ukraine in 1918. But what is true there is that either Lenin or Stalin, they are not adherents anymore of the Russian imperial ideology, including ideology of existing of one nation. They are coming with the idea of the communist international. For them, the Russian Empire, that's the place where the world revolution starts. So from that point of view, who cares whether there is Ukraine and Kazakhstan and Estonia, if eventually they will be Spain and they will be United States and all of them, they will be members of the Union of the Soviet Republics. Just Google the coat of arms of the Soviet Union. You will see nothing there about Russia or about region. You will see there the globe and then the sun of communism raising over this globe. So it's the vision is internationalist and the vision is global. The structure of the Soviet Union was providing opportunity for the republics to have their own territory and to have their really not even autonomous, but still pro forma on the surface their own institutions, Academy of Sciences, separate allegedly Communist Party, which would be controlled from Moscow, but at least pro forma it would be separate. That's really creating a template for the world republic of the world union of the Soviet and socialist republics. And that means tolerance, of course, for national languages and so on and so forth. So none of that is, of course, here today in the Russian vision of itself and Russian vision of Ukraine and Russian vision of the region. So that communism experimentation is certainly anathema for Putin today, and in that sense, when parts of the left are still kind of somehow sympathize with the Russia of today, certainly whatever base is for that sympathy, that the ideology and the type of ideology that is there today in Russia can be that foundation or that base. Now, what you see here is, of course, the Joseph Stalin, and behind him are representation of the Soviet people. But some of people, especially in the first row, they're also dressed in their national costumes, which stresses the idea, the point of the multi-ethnic, if not multinational, composition of the Soviet Union. So the image, of course, that Russia has today is devoid of this kind of a cultural differences. The image is of Russification. And that's what we see today on the occupied territories of Ukraine. So there is no space left for Ukrainian history. My own history books are being thrown out of the libraries, and certainly they're not part of the curriculum. And what moves in, it's basically is the idea that Ukrainians don't exist. Ukrainians are Russians. They're part of Russian nation. So that's in terms of the ideology of the war, which of course places it in a very particular historical context. And that context is really the context of twilight of empire and disintegration of empire and transformation of ideologies associated with empire. This is the image from the December of 1991. The documents are being signed on the dissolution of the Soviet Union. A few weeks before Mikhail Gorbachev steps down as the president of the Soviet Union, the first and the last president. And the gentlemen there sitting behind the table, I will not identify them one by one, but what is important for my presentation, for my story, for my argument is that, ironically, they're the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. So the composite parts of the imperial Russian nation who are now gathering and signing documents on the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The war that we have today is, as I already mentioned, the largest war in Europe, potentially in the world. But it has a very familiar features of the wars that are happening in the world for more than 200 years. This is the war of disintegration of empire. The Russian Empire fell apart in the middle of World War I, like Austria-Hungary fell apart, like Ottoman Empire fell apart. But then the Bolsheviks were able to bring it together, stitch together with the new type of ideology, which was not imperial nationalism, but one can say imperial internationalism. And but at the end of the day, the 20th century, it's the century very much defined by collapse of empires. Apart from, of course, Ottomans and Austria-Hungary, then there was British Empire and French Empire and Portuguese Empire. And the Soviet Union concludes that in 1991, falling apart. Back then, of course, there was belief not just in democracy in Russia and democratic Russia, but there was also, if not belief, then at least hope that we as a humankind, somehow we learn from the past. We can learn the lessons of the past. That here we have the state that is heir to one of the largest empires in the world, disintegrates, concludes and ends its imperial existence without a major war. In the 1990s, there were wars in Yugoslavia, which are very much part of still ongoing process of reformulation of the former Ottoman space and former Austria-Hungarian space. But there was a hope that the Soviet Union went down without a major war. Chechen wars, the world generally closed eyes on that, what was happening there in the 1990s, but the idea was that there would be no war. And then there was Georgia, and then there was annexation of the Crimea in 2014, and the hope was, okay, we see what is happening, but we don't want to recognize or verbalize or think of what that really means. And that really means that Russia wages the wars in the non-Russian territories since the year 1991. That the alleged peace dividend that was very real for a good part of the world really never materialized in the post-Soviet space. Since 91, since 92, the new Russia is in the process of the wars, and those wars are not happening on the Russian territory per se. Again, the Chechen war within the territory of the Russian Federation, but again, you can't even say, like Putin says about Ukraine, that this is allegedly part of Russia, or Chechnya, of course, ethnically, culturally, religiously, and so on and so forth, never was considered to be part of Russia. So we see the story really of the disintegration of empire that is playing out there on more than one level, from ideology, and I talked about that in terms of thinking of what Russia is and what Russia is not, to the specific context of the fall of the Soviet Union and the role, including that Ukraine played in that process, because the dissolution of the Soviet Union happens within 1 week after a Ukrainian referendum that declared independence of Ukraine. And the decision was made in part or mostly on part of Russia, and it was represented by President Yeltsin, that the Soviet Union makes no sense for Russia if Ukraine is not part of the Soviet Union. Why Ukraine played such an important role in the fall of the Soviet Union, that after Ukrainian independence there was no point of continuing. The reason is partially related to Putin's thinking. Again, Yeltsin didn't think that Ukrainians were Russians, but he certainly was thinking in terms of the common Slavic heritage, religious and cultural and otherwise. And he was telling more than once to President George H.W. Bush at that time, it was Bush Sr., it is on the records of their telephone conversation, he was saying that, well, if Ukraine is gone, we are not continuing with the Union because we will be outnumbered and outvoted by the Muslim republics. So at least the explanation that Yeltsin was given to the Americans was that it was also a cultural thing, that with the East Slavic core split, there is no point of Russia, for Russia continuing. Another reason was that Ukraine was the largest Soviet republic after Russia, in terms of the population numbers, in terms of the economic potential, in terms of course, of political influence. The Soviet Union in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s was run very much by the products of the Ukrainian Communist Party machine. So Nikita Khrushchev was the head of the Ukrainian Communist Party and the Republic since 1938, and Brezhnev, of course, came from Ukraine as well. They were not ethnic Ukrainians, they were ethnic Russians who either made their careers or were born and grew up through the ranks in Ukraine. But again, that connection was really very important for the history of the Soviet Union. So Ukraine leaving the Soviet Union leads to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which then brings me to a more recent history, and that's the history of post-Soviet collapse and the history of the region. because collapse of the Soviet Union comes around the same time also with the end of the Cold War. And we see the start of the emergence of the two really different spaces, politically, culturally, militarily, and economically in Europe. One is extended Europe that extends to the east in terms of the political institutions, legal institutions, economic institutions associated normally with European Union, but also in terms of security and military infrastructure that comes with NATO. We see the attempts of Russia to really maintain its control on the post-Soviet space. The model there is the creation, the name can change, but basically some sort of Eurasian Union. It starts with immediately in 91 when Yeltsin and Ukrainian leader Kravchuk and Belarusian leader Shushkevich, they not just dissolve the Soviet Union, they create something instead of it, which is called the Commonwealth of Independent States, and they look at that very differently. For Ukrainians, they from the start go say, okay, that's the institution for the civilized divorce. When Yeltsin goes to the Russian parliament and asks to approve the creation of the Commonwealth, he says, okay, that's the only way under the circumstances that Russia can still continue its if not control, then presence in the region. So from the start go, there are very different expectations from Ukraine and Russia on what will happen there. And then already under Vladimir Putin, at the beginning of the century, at the beginning of the millennium, the Commonwealth model is abandoned and the model of all sorts of Eurasian unions are being formed and created. The Russian geopolitical thinking in the 1990s changes. The bipolar world of the Cold War is gone, and unipolar American world is taking shape in the 1990s. So the unipolar world is not acceptable for the Russian elites, and I'm talking about elites even before Putin. But they also realize that there is no return to the bipolar world for a number of reasons. So the model there is multipolar world. But multipolar world is not the world in which there is 150 poles, right? It's the world in which there is more than 2, but probably less than 5 or something like that. So if for Russia to be a center, one of the poles in multipolar world, it has to be on par or compete with China on the one hand and with the enlarged European Union on the other. To do that for a country that is not even member of the 10 largest economies and to be one of the global centers, you need really to mobilize the resources of the larger than one country, which automatically comes imperial space, Soviet space, or post-imperial and post-Soviet space. And to achieve that, you need more than a couple of countries. You again need Ukraine. If it's the second largest, if the Soviet Union fell apart very much on the account of what happened in Ukraine and referendum there. So any sort of project, no matter whether you called it Commonwealth or Eurasian Union or any other union, there is a big hole there if the second largest piece of the puzzle is not there. So Ukraine becomes also important for those reasons, not just historical that I just described, but also for the reasons of economy, but also geographic location and position. And that brings me to the question that is very often in the news as explanation of the Russian aggression beyond these historical things that I talked about, and this is the expansion of NATO. And I will try to test this argument just looking at the chronology of the events, so something that historians are trained to do no matter whether we are writing about processes that already completed or processes that are still in the development. First of all, the story of the NATO enlargement. You look on the map and there is no question that NATO is moving east. But if you are a historian and you read the documents coming from the 1990s, you get a very different picture. What you see is actually not NATO moving east, but east moving west, because it's the Poles, it's the Romanians, it's the Hungarians, it's the Czechs who are knocking on the door of NATO and the United States in particular, saying, we know history, you all believe that Russia is democratic, but we have our history of 200 years to believe. We want to be safe, we want to be admitted. And NATO sort of lost its purpose after 1991. It lost its purpose for Europeans, it's lost its purpose to a degree to the Americans, but it actually didn't lose any purpose, but acquired new purpose for the aspiring members, for the Europeans. So what you see, the general trend is that the former Soviet-controlled part of Europe is running for the cover of Western institutions, including NATO. And Ukraine, in that sense, is not an exception, it's just part of the rule. That's how you behave when you are in this neighborhood. Ukrainians are late to the game, deciding what they want and where they want to go, but their behavior, their intentions are exactly the same. They're knocking on the doors of the European Union because the mobilized part of the society wants rule of law and doesn't like corruption, and has hopes that European Union bring not just prosperity, but also will bring different rules, economic and political rules, and would support democracy when it is under attack. And then there is the country as a whole that looks around and thinks that actually NATO is the only game in town when you think about the claims made on your territory, and Russia makes claim on Ukrainian territory since '92 on the Crimea and other parts. So, and the NATO says to Ukraine and European Union says to Ukraine, maybe in a much more louder voice than it said to the Poles and to the others, is that we don't want you. The Bucharest summit of 2007, Ukraine wants to be invited to apply for NATO membership, and the answer is, well, one day you will become part of NATO, but we can't say you what day it will be and whether we'll be still around or not. So the accession to the European Union is a problem as well. So what we see here, once again, either it's Ukraine, either it's Poland, either it's any part of Europe that was under the Russian and Soviet control, the initiative to move west and run for the defense of the European institutions, that initiative comes from the region. It's not like there is any supporters or whatsoever in the NATO European Union, there are, but the initiative comes from there, and the first answer that each of these countries get is no, or not now, or wait. And that's very important to keep in mind, trying to understand this war. And now I'm bringing the chronology. I was talking about geopolitics, now I'm bringing chronology into this picture. So the war started in March of 2014. After victory in Ukraine of the revolution that has different names, Euro Revolution or Revolution of Dignity. No matter how you call those developments and those protests, the outcome was the same. the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, who promised to Ukrainians for more than 1 year that he would sign association agreement with European Union, not membership, association agreement with European Union. Eventually, then under Russian pressure, says we are not going to do that, people go to the streets, and then it develops. So the new government that comes and replaces Yanukovych, the first thing that it says, okay, we are signing an association agreement with European Union. Within a few days, within a few weeks, Russia starts the war. Now, what is association agreement with European Union? Why anyone should care about that? Well, the association agreement with European Union, that's mostly about trade, a little bit about politics, but the key thing about that agreement is that if any country signs association agreement with European Union, that's the guys in blue. They can't sign similar agreement with any other trade bloc or any other union. Look at the guys in yellow. It's not just Russia, there are Kazakhstan, there is a bunch of other former Soviet republics. So Ukraine signing association agreement with European Union, it leaves the Russian sphere of influence. So we have the situation in which using the language of the 17th and 18th and other centuries, the slave tries to escape. And the master employs whatever it has at its power, at its exposure to stop that from happening. So we are returning again to the same story of imperial space, post-imperial control, where again ideology, understanding of history, and geopolitics, they all come together. Which makes me think that if one of those interpretations, let's say, wrong, but if they click somewhere together, there is something about that. Now, what we have now in terms of the a couple of maps. That's how it starts. It's 2014, the annexation of the Crimea. Ukraine doesn't resist, or at least militarily, for a number of reasons. First of all, psychologically, it's a shock. They're not prepared. Politically, the country is in a sort of, the new government won came to power as the result of this revolution of dignity, where the not armed forces, but certainly the police was used against them. So even establishing control over the territory and the police, this is a very difficult period. It's sort of interregnum, so they can't mobilize there as well. And what Russia is saying, signing the Minsk agreements with Ukraine, forcing Ukraine to sign it under the threat of further military aggression, was that, Russia says we keep Crimea, that's done thing, but we also de facto control regions in your east, and we want you to rewrite constitution. We want those regions to get into the Ukrainian constitutional space, be part of Ukraine. And under the constitution, every region has the power to block any major decision, especially foreign policy decision. So basically, we'll control part of your territory, and we will stop and we'll block any movement of your left or right if you don't like it. So that was the deal of Minsk agreements. There were high hopes first that the President Poroshenko would deliver to Russia what Russia wanted. Then President Zelensky, unexperienced stand-up comedian who becomes the president of Ukraine, that he would actually deliver what Putin wanted. And then by 2022, there is a realization that it doesn't matter who is the president in Ukraine. Ukraine continues to be a democracy, and whoever is the president would be listening to the people. and that there is no point of waiting for new elections, no point of waiting for the new president, that the only option that Russia has is really occupation. And that's what started in 2022, producing the largest war in Europe. The war is, as I said, is not over yet. We don't know when it will end. We don't know how it will end. The general trend for me as a historian, of course, very obvious. We know what happens with empires. Eventually they fall. Eventually the countries come into existence. That's where my optimism as a historian comes from, where my pessimism as a historian comes from, that I know that it's not, the fall of empire, it's not an event. And it can take a lot of time that goes beyond the lifespan of one human being, or even a number of generations, and that's what is concerning. Now, with the war not being over, the world has already dramatically changed as the result of that war. This is the image from Kiev, from downtown Kiev, a monument to Ukrainian-Russian friendship that was built in the early 1980s, so the last decade of the existence of the Soviet Union. The monument survived the start of the war in 2014, but it didn't survive the Russian attacks on Kiev in February of 2022. So this is the image from March of 2022. That monument, like other monuments celebrating either friendship with Russia or Russian cultural figures or political figures, are being removed in Ukraine. This is the process of that happening. And looking at attitudes in Ukraine, certainly today, one can pretty safely say that the war that on the Russian side started under the banner of Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same, produced within a very short period of time completely opposite result. So the level of Ukrainian exclusive identity, and that's a nice way to say about hatred toward Russia, is extremely high. And given how long the war is going on, the suffering, that everyone is under missile attack nightly, no one can go to bed being sure that that person would wake up. That's the reality of situation today in Ukraine. That certainly produces a sense of differenceness from Russia that no other thing but the war, the modern war, can produce. We don't have data on what is happening in Russia today for obvious reasons, but I think it would be a stretch to imagine that now more than 1 million people either killed or wounded in this war, that these body bags, when they come back to Russia, that they deliver exactly the message that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So this war certainly became a turning point in terms of relations between Russians and Ukrainians. Again, as I said, goes completely contrary to what the goals were, what the expectations were. Relations with Europe, between Russia and Europe and Ukraine as well. We are not on the level of the Berlin Wall. That's the image that comes from there. But certainly there is a major turning point in Russia's relations with Europe, including the economic ones. The period that started with detente in the Cold War, the period that started in the early 1970s with the first Russian gas coming to Austria and then to Germany and then continuing with Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, that period certainly came to an end. The idea that you can make business with Russia and make money and peace at the same time, that seemed to be a winning formula in the Cold War and the fall of Berlin Wall in 1989. So I don't now see anyone really believing that you can achieve both goals at the same time and in communication with Russia. Another thing that is happening is that the period in which that followed the Cold War, in which there were so-called gray areas in Europe, came to an end as well. Ukraine was a neutral state, de facto, that was attacked, that gave up its nuclear weapons and then had no deterrent to protect itself. That period is pretty much gone. A major blow is delivered to non-proliferation regime, because no responsible politician today, whether it's a democratically elected politician or it is an authoritarian politician or the king or the queen, can really entertain safely the idea that it's a good thing to give up nuclear weapons, or if that country has nuclear weapons, that it's a good thing to rely on the Article 5 of NATO, or if you are South Korea, or if you are Japan. That's certainly an incentive to think about how you can protect yourself when the Americans are not there. This is image from 1950s, the Soviet-Chinese friendship. So we are now back in terms of the Russian-Chinese alliance, with roles being changed there. So now it's Chinese who are in the driving seat, and Russia increasingly becoming the state, if not the vassal state, then the state clearly dependent on China. So this war produced already proportions that are produced changes that proportionally are in par with the war itself in terms of its scope, and we are not over yet. The big question, of course, and the big thing is now, what does this all mean for Europe? And for Europe, the war really manifested the end of the era that started at least with 1945. The war produced really increasingly more and more aggressive Russia, and more and more absent United States. Which puts on the agenda a very simple question of how Europe can protect its way of life, its economy and its economic prosperity in this new world, where the language of the power politics now coming not only from Beijing or Moscow, but also from Washington. Ukrainians are really, by their defense, that very few people expected that there would be that sort of resistance, and now buying time for Europe really to put its acts together and not just act, but also try to figure out what is the way out of this predicament. Because one thing is quite obvious, and I can tell you that as a historian who studies continuity and change in human history, that we are living in the time of change. And I think history and historical experience can help us to navigate that new uncharted waters, that new area, that new space, that called future, that will be very different. So I will stop here, and I will be, of course, more than happy to, I hope I am within my time, more or less, probably I went a little bit over. We'll be happy to engage in the discussion and answer your questions. Let's move to something more optimistic. I don't know what it can be. But okay, that's Ukrainians demonstrating for
nice. Thank you very much for this first part of the conference. Ara passem a la segona part. Us he de dir que aquesta conferència està emmarcada en l'assignatura de Global Studies de la Facultat d'Humanitats, una assignatura que fem de la llengua russa, però també introducció a la cultura d'aquella part del món i també de literatures eslaves. Nosaltres hem llegit capítols d'aquest llibre que abans he citat i obrim torn de preguntes amb 3 preguntes que ja hem preparat, mentre el resta del públic també, evidentment, podeu preguntar, però amb els estudiants ens hem preparat força, aleshores per trencar el gel i passar a aquesta segona part de la conferència, doncs començarem amb algunes preguntes preparades. Aquí tenim el micro, podem fer de 3 en 3 i així gaudim també d'aquesta segona part. Gaudir no és la paraula perquè és un tema molt dramàtic, però aprofitem que tenim aquí el professor Plokhy que ens pot contestar durant els propers 35 minuts a les preguntes que li podem fer. Gràcies. Sí. Bueno, espera. Tu no, els estudiants ara.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your conference. We've learned a lot from you. Some of us were global studies students, and it is a multidisciplinary degree. So when Tamara first explained it to us that we were coming here, we were especially interested in the fact that you're a historian talking on current global affairs. So we wanted to ask you on the role of history, because we are people that we are interested in working in international organizations in the future, we are interested in policy making. So we wanted to ask you what's your advice on us, how to use history as a tool to understand current global affairs, because we believe that the fact that you're from another discipline, it's very important. And you have a unique perspective that we have to take into account. We believe it is very important and we want to hear from you because you are the historian here. And also if you felt maybe underestimated when publishing, because usually people that publish on current global affairs are people that have studied political sciences or maybe geopolitics. If you felt underestimated when publishing, that's very interesting to us. So if you want to talk about it.
Thank you. Thank you for this question. I will answer bringing up my own experience. When I was in the secondary school or high school, I wanted to be a journalist, and we had family discussion, and my father convinced me. He said, well, if you have a talent, you would be right in one way or another. But what if you don't have a talent? Maybe you just get some more solid education. And so somehow at the family, this council, we agreed that it would be history. And then I went and studied history and got stuck in history. But the point is that I think that the history, that's something, one field that gives you basic knowledge and understanding from where you can go into a number of professions. And at Harvard, unfortunately, my best students go into law, but also if you think about international relations, if you think about even about investment and how many people from history and humanities are being hired now, because they have the knowledge and they have different sort of thinking than people who are trained in economics have. So that's the general point, that I think that history provides understanding of, including international relations, but human condition in general, to a degree that maybe no other field provides. Then what I find very useful about other fields, they provide methodology, right? But you can't live on methodology alone. You need some understanding. You need knowledge, right? And you need good knowledge. And you don't get good knowledge really outside of the either university or your personal experience. And going into international relations, I would say good knowledge is, first of all, not exclusively, but comes from history. Maybe depressingly, there are so many things, especially when it comes to international relations, there are new things, but then there are others that repeat themselves. And we had a conversation just before this lecture about the American policy, and to what degree it's new and not, and it is new in very many respects, but on the other hand, if you know about American policy during the interwar period, about isolationism, if you know something about the American policy of the 18th century when they were trying to stay away from the European relations, how they reacted to World War I, that can help you maybe better understand also that the current turn is not just a fluke. If you don't have all that knowledge, you are really lost. I think that the society without history, it's like a human being without memory. It's a society with sort of Alzheimer. So taking history, we can think that about medication against Alzheimer, about our just collective forgetness. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, first of all, for your conference, Professor. My question is, would you say that Russia's goal is to consolidate control over the territories it has already annexed, such as Crimea or Donbass, or does Russia aim for more? Perhaps even to reclaim the historical lands of Kiev and Rus? Thank you.
Thank you. What we have there, especially now, when people are talking about potential ceasefire or peace, there is an assumption that somehow by ceding a couple of territories here and there, you can solve the problem. That allegedly that's the conflict, the territorial conflict, which it is not. And it's a conflict, on the one hand, you mentioned Kiev and Rus, that's very much about the core of also Putin's thinking about consolidation of what he considers to be Russian nation, right? So that's the model, because there is understanding generally in Russia that the imperial phase is gone, it passed, right? And the model for every country that used to be an empire, for the metropolis, tried to create a nation state. And we know that these attempts, you look at the biggest empires, you look at Spanish Empire and Spain today, and look at Britain, so it's a complicated task. You here in Barcelona know that better than I do. But that's what Russia tries to do. They're not going anymore after attempt to include into their state, let's say, Kazakhstan, but they're certainly trying to include Ukraine and Belarus as the idea of creating of this old new Russian nation of the future. So the point is, it's not about territory, and you can't buy peace if that's the goal by ceding one or two territories. And then there is also a story of Russia as a global player. And as a global player, it certainly doesn't at this point, it doesn't put ahead, let's say, the goal of going and annexing back Baltic states or annexing Poland. But they're certainly very much interested in the more kind of imperialistic tradition of controlling this territory, so influencing them, or certainly the splitting the European Union, because in one way or another, as in practical terms, because if you do that, then the bar for you is lower to become one of the centers in multipolar world. So the more Hungaries and Slovakias you have in the European Union, the better position the Russian position is. and of course presence in the Mediterranean, Syria. So there are global interests as well. That means that the policy of either neglect or appeasement by ceding this part or that part of Ukraine really doesn't address any of this kind of deeper underlying reasons for Russian foreign policy.
Thank you. There is also, they asked me yesterday, from where Russia takes money for this war. I didn't know the answer. Then, if you know, you can tell something. Thank you.
I'm not an economist, but most of money, again, looking at the data that is being provided now, it's from the export of oil and oil products. So it's a little bit coal, gas, more than that, but mostly it's oil and gasoline and other things delivered, and it's not even liquefied thing. All of that stuff is delivered by tankers. Big attempts and only to a degree successive somehow to clamp down on that particular trade. Europe sends roughly equal amount of money today to Russia and to Ukraine. For Ukraine in the form of buying weapons and economic support, for Russia in the form of payment for oil, which not directly necessarily comes to Europe, but goes through the third countries. And that continuing de facto dependence on the Russian oil and oil products, despite the political stand of sanctions and condemning that and things like that, that's what keeps funding the Russian war machine and keep subsidizing the war. The huge stories, of course, in that China and India, which are having a fantastic time buying Russian oil at the discounted prices and reselling it, and then selling other things that Russia imports. Russian drones would not be flying if it would depend just on the Russian industry, as simple as that, or missiles would not be flying. Then the West says we are condemning that, but then trade is happening through Kyrgyzstan, trade is happening through Belarus, which are controlled by Russia one way or another. So the big story, it's just resupply for Russian airplanes that are aging and can't fly anymore. So you can't export to Russia, but now they opened that in the United States. They opened you can actually supply Belarus. And suddenly Belarus and Kyrgyzstan become major importers of all sorts of things that they import 100 times more than they can consume. Of course, all of that goes to Russia. So there is the books of that international trade are cooked, and that unfortunately continues.
Meu colega.
Thank you. Well, apologies if I'm taking advantage a little bit of my position here, but very quick. Thank you for your conference, first of all, extremely interesting and relevant. Somehow, I felt that you assume some sort of inevitability of the war. And I wonder if with someone different from Putin in Russia's power, the war would have happened in the same vein. So I'm somehow challenging you, taking you out from the comfortable position of a historian talking about the past.
Yes, thank you. Well, I feel that there are at least two people inside of me on that question, or certainly two voices. One is just a human being living through these times, and certainly living through the fall of the Soviet Union and being part of the general euphoria about democratic Russia of the future, and certainly the end of history, in a sense, the end of the violence and big wars. That's also was my surprise in 2022 that I describe in my book about the war, because you don't want it to happen, and you find the reasons and explanations of why it shouldn't happen. And then once it happens, you look at it as a historian at that, and what you find, it's not that it was inevitable, but it was extremely likely. And then the role of individual, the role of Putin in particular. What we know about this war is that American intelligence was exceptionally successful in penetrating really the inner circle of Putin, knowing even to a degree of the time of the invasion. But it was very narrow circle, and for a big part of the Russian elite, the decision to go to war was a big surprise, which suggests that, okay, let's think about that as Putin's war. But then you look at that differently, and what Putin was trying to replicate in 2022 was success over the annexation of the Crimea in 2014, which really saved him from declining ratings after the economic downturn in Russia. He suddenly became extremely popular. So the point was, again, just rally around the flag during the war, another way to deal with the fallen ratings, which suggests that this is also a Russian war, that the society as a whole is going through this post-imperial transition and era. So we see, under different circumstances, there could be different behavior, but we really see politician Putin behaving really very much and trying to anticipate also the support or lack of support for him in the and particular actions in the society, despite the fact that he is 25 years in power, authoritarian, and really there is no real elections to speak about in Russia. And last comment on inevitable or not, I think that the cure to the post-imperial syndrome for any country, it's not just Russia, it's a defeat, right? If you don't suffer a defeat, then you are doing everything right. And I am against absolutely blaming the West for anything that is happening in Russia, because that presumes that's really kind of Western now, sort of colonial. We can go anywhere and we can decide. If you take responsibility for what is happening, that means think in imperialist terms. Russia is a big country, marching to its own drumbeat, politically, economically, and otherwise. But the West can also influence and at least send some signals. And my position is that if reaction to the war in Chechnya would be at least half in terms of the pushback that Putin got on Georgia, there would be no Georgia. If the reaction to Georgia would be at least half of what he got on the Crimea, there would be no Crimea, and so on and so forth. But if you continue appeasement, you're certainly encouraging the continuing expansion. It's not like you are helping the situation. You're making it worse. But all of that, I reserve for the West its only limited kind of ability to influence Russia and Russian behavior, or responsibility for what Russia is doing, or the tendency to claim credit for something. It's the countries, and especially such big countries, they are their own actors, and I think we should also admit that. Thank you.
More questions? Monica, i després. Yes, you, and then we make 3 questions, and then, okay, yeah. Yeah, you. Ja que tens el micro i així.
Well, thanks for coming, first of all. I know it's a long flight. And talking about the subject of inevitability, do you think that, given precedents in history, because you're a historian, so maybe you could almost shed some light on the possibility that the war will bring such instability to Russia that it might topple the regime? Maybe from the elites who are tired of the strife and the sanctions and this and that, or from the masses who are just suffering highly economically from sanctions and whatnot.
Yes, that's certainly a possibility, and we witnessed even in 23 military mutiny, right? Which points in that direction that this is not completely inconceivable. If you look historically at Russian history, the revolution of 1905 comes as the or trigger is the lost not the entire war with Japan, but the defeats on there in the Far East. If you look at the revolution of 1917, that's war not going well for Russia, World War I. So generally, the victorious war strengthened regimes. The lost wars produce either revolutions or reforms. Because again, looking at Russia, the Crimean War that was lost produces a major a series of reforms in the Russian Empire in the second half of the 19th century. So that is very, very likely outcome. Again, I don't think that, not that I don't think, I'm sure, with all the horrible things that Russia does to Ukraine and to the international relations in general, this war is not good for Russia, for Russian economy, or for long-term Russian interests. So whoever will come after Putin, there will be, and in non-democratic regimes, the only way when there is a correction of the course and rethinking is when there is the king is dead, and then the new king comes in, and that's the only way how you can correct the course. And Russia is notorious for every next president really trashing his predecessor. So Khrushchev did that with Stalin. Brezhnev did that to a degree with Khrushchev. Gorbachev certainly waged war on the so-called zastoya, stagnation under Brezhnev. And of course, Gorbachev was persona non grata under Putin. So that's you can pretty much count on that. Whoever comes after Putin, it will be some consideration. Society doesn't change as dramatically, but certainly there will be some reassessment.
Okay. Thank you very much. You have very clear ideas, and I think all of us know much more than before. I would like to ask you about if the West did something wrong, because this is like a big discussion. Many scholars are always thinking, what did we do wrong? Should we have started talking more to Russia and making more partnership and association, even when Gorbachev was there, and with continue with Yeltsin? Who knows what would have happened? What do you think? Well, Russia says, that it was humiliated by, especially Clinton, mistreating Yeltsin in the 90s. And so I was just wondering if this didn't happen, and if more effort was there for, to develop a good relationship with Russia, what would have happened, would you think?
Yeah, thank you. That's basically, I will develop what I just said in a sense that I think that thinking that the West had a decisive role in defining Russians' behavior or blaming the West for what happened in Russia, I think it's basically not just counterproductive, but really overestimating the power of the West over countries like Russia or China, which have their long historical tradition of the way how they're doing things, and a lot of naivete. I'm speaking about myself. I talked about that in terms of imagining a democratic Russia, and then it's not happening, and then I'm going back to the textbooks and realize that, okay, that country never lived under any form of democracy. It's not like it will never live in the future, but the transition to democracy can't happen overnight, with Yeltsin getting on the tank, pronouncing good speech, and then suddenly Russia is democratic, because that's what we expected to a degree, maybe not verbalizing that, but that was a big hope. The communism is over, so now is freedom, and freedom automatically will bring democracy and prosperity and all these other things. And history tells you something else. So what is the only way how to deal with the aggressor is basically stopping aggression. There is no other way. So basically, appeasement didn't work in the 1930s. It didn't work now in the last 20 years. It will not work in the future. So that doesn't mean doesn't mean to say, okay, we don't have to somehow be in contact, in touch, and support whatever are liberal and democratic and pro-European forces or tendencies in Russia. But one thing that last 30 years, at least what I learned from them, that these are, and many of them were, and some of them are still my friends, they're the minority in that country. They need support, but you can't count on them seriously, long term, on leading that country or producing some form of dramatic transition. So this illusion should stay where they were and turn themselves to be wrong. So yeah, I think we have to be more realistic now. The time has come.
Sí, ja he vist que heu agafat el micro per si de cas.
Hello, thank you very much for the conference. It was really interesting. So you started talking on how Putin views the war and how he views this idea, this imperial idea of the 19th century of Russia and the Great Russia, and in the 19th century that translated into Russification. Do you think that picking up that idea from the 19th century and bringing it to today, to the 21st century, has cost Russia in waging a genocide in Ukraine? Would you consider this war is a part of Russia trying to genocide Ukrainian culture and identity? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, there are different terms, so genocide is one of them, but clearly it's about wiping up the separate national group, linguistic group, cultural group. There is no question about that. So there are 1,000 definitions of genocide. I'm not sure what percent of those definitions that fit, but that's what is happening on the ground. Thank you.
Si vols fer una, podem tenir un parell més, màxim 3. Vols fer una?
Be very quick. As a historian who studies patterns of change and continuity, do you think that there is some parallelism between the Spanish Civil War and the Russo-Ukrainian War in the sense that it is a testing ground for new for new weapons, building new alliances, and the fact that this war could lead to something even bigger?
Yes, thank you. I think that this is a very good parallel. This parallel doesn't work in terms of the causes of the war per se, right? So it's at least what I know about the Spanish Civil War, it is very much ideological, right? And ideological divisions were there. And the national component was there, but maybe it was secondary kind of a support in this ideological divide. So in that sense, maybe it's not apples and apples, it's apples and oranges. But in terms of basically how this war plays out in terms of international relations, I think that's very much a good parallel and correct parallel, thinking from the use of aviation and bombing, and now to what you see with the drones. Clearly, technology changing, and this is a testing ground. Everyone is watching. I mean, military experts watching exactly what is happening in Ukraine, not only on the ground but also in the sea. With Ukrainians are a country without a fleet, really defeating country with fleet on the sea with a bunch of drones, right? Sea drones, which is absolutely revolutionary and unheard of. And in terms of the testing of the alliances, so I on all these points that you listed, I fully agree with you. I think this is a very good and potentially productive parallel to look at that and to also get better understanding of this war now in Ukraine through looking at the Spanish Civil War. Thank you.
Yes. So first of all, I'd like to thank you for coming and letting us know that this war keeps going on, although we sometimes forget about it. And then, so what are the environmental effects, like destroying crops or people's belonging? What are the side effects of the war? And since the EU has been spending great amount of money on self-defense and everything, do you think that Russia represents a real threat to the EU or not? As seen in Poland, or yes. Russia is just showing off?
Yes, sure. So on the environmental impact, of course, it's huge. It's enormous. You look at the front lines and eastern part of Ukraine, on the destroyed cities, on the destroyed vegetation. It's the worst kind of scenes that we can imagine from World War I, from the front lines in Europe. But now they're just scaled up. They're much bigger. And then the blowing up of the Kakhovka Dam in particular. So it's a huge impact, not only on the changing of the environment, but also the water that was coming to the Crimea, to other places, to irrigation is not there anymore. So it's a corrosion of land. The people, of course, are moved. The millions of people are on the move. Some of them are here in Europe, in Spain, you know that. But more people are on the move in Ukraine than outside of Ukraine. And I worked on one of my books on the Russian takeover of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And I worked with people in the Ukraine's office of the general prosecutor who are also looking, they have a special division looking at the environmental impact and building cases to prosecute responsible for that. So it is not just theoretical thing, it's even institutionally that they already, it has impact on what the Ukrainian government is doing, realizing the actual impact. In terms of threat, well, it's now we don't have even to speculate, right? So the September 10th, 19 drones, this is not a mistake. This is just poking the NATO defenses, attack on the NATO country with actually mute response or no response at all, which means NATO is not prepared to respond to that. The Russian planes going into the Baltic states, the Russian drones paralyzing the airports in Europe. I was in Ukraine in September, going back through Poland and then through Zurich. Of course, the planes are delayed. They're always delayed. You don't need war for our planes to be delayed. But then delayed, the German airspace is closed for whatever reason. So it's not something that we should speculate about or just read. You try to travel and you already see the whole disruption. That's a threat. That's more than a threat. That's an attack, and there is no response. There is no response because it's inconceivable, and then how you put all of this together, and whether you shoot them down or you don't shoot them down, and the legal base is not ready for the guy who raises for $100 that they paid him, raises the drone over the international airport. There is no even article in the criminal code that you can go after that. So technology is developing much faster and being employed for the war purposes much faster than we adapt. So it's not a threat. If it is a threat, it is a very real one. Thank you.
I think that we have a last question there, or maybe one and the last question here. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much for this conference. I have two questions. The first one, when did Russian nationalism first begin to take shape? And then, what's your opinion of Zelensky politics?
What is second?
What's your opinion of Zelensky politics?
Sure, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Russian nationalism, well, it's very, very... I have a book which is called Lost Kingdom, where subtitle is The History of Russian Nationalism since 1470 or something like that, which really means some elements that would go into nationalism. I believe, I subscribe to the school that thinks that modern nationalism is 19th, 20th century creation. And in that sense, the Russian nationalism, in this modern sense of nationalism, is a product of Napoleonic wars, like many others, and also responds not only to the French ideas and use of those ideas, but also to the rise of Polish nationalism, modern nationalism after Poland lost its state, right? And even the term narodność or ethnicity, it's a borrowing from Polish, from narodowość, and so on and so forth. So it's Russians have specific problems with separating nationalism from empire of the sort that any empire, imperial power that was there in the 19th century has. So there are attempts to merge the two. So they're not necessarily, in the case of the metropolis, nationalism and imperialism, they are not necessarily somehow at odds with each other. They work together and they can support each other. So that's a historical answer on the origins of Russian nationalism, modern nationalism in particular. On Zelensky, I was absolutely terrified when he was elected, a person with no experience whatsoever. And yeah, I'm now someone coming from Ukraine. I'm happy that Ukraine has that president now in the conditions of the war. So he turned out to be personally very brave, and overall in this absolutely impossible situation that goes not just one day or 2 days, just year into year. It's impossible. I don't know where he gets energy and where he gets any sort of optimism to keep going. But it's not to say that there are no systematic problems or mistakes with his leadership. But overall, I think it's really outstanding. Thank you.
Really here, the last question.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. I wanted to talk about what you've just mentioned, that you've talked about the NATO and the European Union saying no to those countries who want to join them. I was wondering if just maybe accepting them wouldn't be a way of maybe preventing Russia trying to take further expansions in future.
Yes. Well, one thing that this war showed, that not even joining European Union, but signing association agreement with European Union provoked the Russian aggression. And that means that, again, I was talking about that, but I just want to emphasize that unless European Union can protect itself in these new conditions, also with force, with the army, militarily, it's extremely vulnerable. So it certainly provides a very attractive model for all these countries of the region, economic and political and legal, that becomes attractive. Russia tries to wage wars to keep countries within its union. And European Union has a line-up of people standing for years and knocking on the doors. So that just, and it's not just about wealth. Say, okay, European Union is richer, and that is, it's not about that. But we reach the point, which I don't think we would ever reach, that unless you can actually protect that becomes really, really, the value of all of that is, or long-term value becomes problematic. So admitting in European Union under the current circumstances is not enough. NATO or whatever will replace NATO. That is needed, and not just for the new members, but also for members that already exist within the Union. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We can continue. We hope that you will come back soon, and we could have some larger maybe course about all these issues. And I also hope that you could talk in the future about this war like a past, like really a historian, yes. We really all hope. Thank you so much. Moltes gràcies a tothom. Gràcies a Josep Ibañez Muñoz, que és comissionat de l'EUTOPIA, un programa de diverses comunitats europees que també en el marc d'aquesta iniciativa es poden organitzar cursos interuniversitaris. Gràcies a col·legues, gràcies també a la professora i vicerectora d'Internacional, Elena Ramallinho, que s'ha adjuntat, ha estat a l'acte amb la Premi Nobel d'Economia, que ha fet la lliçó inaugural de la Facultat d'Economia, també avui. Gràcies a tots per la vostra assistència i molt especialment als estudiants. Fa molt de temps que en un acte no havia tants estudiants i tanta gent jove, que és d'agrair molt. Espero que heu après. I jo crec que possiblement la conferència no ha parlat molt d'esperança i no hem sigut molt optimistes de moment, però sí que a mi particularment em dona molt optimisme veure que hi ha tanta gent jove interessada per sentir i per participar també en un acte on es parla d'Ucraïna, on es parla de Rússia i Ucraïna, d'aquesta guerra, del seu present, també dels temes del passat, i esperem que, com hem dit abans, que aviat pugui tornar i parlar d'aquests temes en un curs més llarg aquí a la Pompeu, com un esdeveniment del passat com a historiador. Moltes gràcies i bona tarda.
Gràcies.